You have likely heard that there are probably just about 7 stories that exist. Now, the idea being that every story that's been told or retold is actually a variation on one of these stories. Now, these 7 tales express themselves through different characters, different settings, different dangling details and threads, but at their core, they are reimaginings of essential plots, essential struggles, essential aspirations. Similarly, we believe that in the world of public libraries, there are likely a handful of stories that we tell over and over, essential, foundational stories. Now, in our case, stories can translate as service. So there are many ways to tell a story, to retell a story. And in telling a story a different way, somehow a new tale emerges that doesn't erase that essence of its original. Reimagining a story doesn't destroy its meaning or its impact. Reimagining, recasting, rethinking, all these words speak to our desire to innovate. Understanding our essential stories can help us isolate the ingredients that we have to work with, and thus helping create a clear base for innovation. Now, in the world of libraries, one of our essential stories is the power and importance of literacy. Again, I'm Tony Tallent.
And I'm George Schafer, and this is Reading Reinvented. And as every story that's about reinvention, it begins with wonder, curiosity, and questions that make us want to know more.
In our case, we had 2 really large questions that came out of a pile of many, many sizes of questions. Our number one question was, how can the library become a sort of laboratory, a playground of sorts in which we can allow ourselves to evolve, to meet community needs in new ways? Our second question, knowing that there are a wide array of learning and reading styles, how can we craft a living and action-oriented way to test current literacy research? Richland Library and Clemson University discovered that together we had a mutual curiosity and agreed to work toward trying to solve these 2 large questions at the same time. What resulted was a multisensory space for reading, and we called it the Lit Room. Now, the Lit Room was a fully functioning prototype housed in Richland Library's children's space between 2014 and 2016. This innovative space was also for many things. It was for experimenting. It was testing our assumptions. It was for pushing our ideas about what the library can do to affect positive change in the realm of youth literacy. Now, all this project emerged from a partnership funded by the National Science Foundation.
So at its core, the Lit Room is a high-concept idea with a real-world impact for telling stories. And like every story, it has a backstory. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about ours. So in 2011, I was a doctoral student beginning my studies in Clemson's Intelligent Materials, Systems, and Environments Laboratory in the School of Architecture. Now, many of you probably have not heard the term architectural-robotics before, and I had not either when I started in that program. But in fact, there have been many books written about the subject, including this one, which features the Lit Room. You can see with that small red picture of it in the center. So in any case, in that laboratory, we focused on finding real-world applications for robotics at an architectural scale. Some of the work that had already been done in the laboratory was considering applications in the workplace, like this reconfigured desk where one space becomes many spaces. They had also considered applications in the healthcare environment, where a distributed suite of robotic furniture helps with wellness and healing. But my interest really was in finding applications in educational context. And I wanted to create a transfigured environment that created a portal to another space. It sounds easy, doesn't it? Well, when we think about innovation and reinvention, the first hurdle is often that big idea. What exists now, and how do I want to change it? So I asked myself, how do I merge robotics and education in a way that creates a portal to another world? What exactly would it look like? Where would it occur? So those were the questions that lingered at the beginning of our story, and here's how the story unfolded. So one day I was visiting Tony, as I often did at his home base at Richland Library, and on this particular day, I walked into the children's room, and on the back of the children's room wall is this larger-than-life mural depicting scenes from Maurice Sendak's beloved picture book, Where the Wild Things Are. So I saw children and families reading together, and I thought about how many of us have memories of story time in public library spaces. I mean, can't you remember listening to a librarian, reading a book, and you being transported to another place in time? Because it really is, it is an experience that's part of our collective story. So I began to make connections between my memories, what I was seeing in the space on that day, and my vague notions about what robotics-assisted space could do. And I asked, what if architectural robotics could transform the space of the library into the space of the book? Well, we all know who this mischievous little guy is, right? So I also thought about Max in the moment in Where the Wild Things Are when he's sent to his room without supper, and slowly his bedroom transforms into the forest of his imagination. And I wondered, could children's literacy actually be cultivated in a space that is both physical and digital and evocative of the picture book itself? Could we create space where words become worlds? This was the essence of the proposal that we shared.
That's no small proposal. So naturally, when we had it coming at us, quite a few questions, concerns, and imaginations started rising. But some of the things that our library team members questioned was if they could have play an actual viable role in a project that was based in emerging technology on such a large scale as what we envisioned the Lit Room to be. Also, the capacity of mixing public library service with a true research-based project surfaced within our talks. Was there enough common ground between what Clemson wanted to do and the public library service that we know how to do best? These were questions that hopefully you're asking yourselves right now. How can you merge your service with universities, academic libraries if you're public, or special libraries? There was also the concern that is always like a little punch right in the stomach. Will this be good for the children? Will this be good for the children that we serve? Or will it just be another iteration of more screen time and pushing more tech on a already distracted group of kids? Now, for a while, these stories and questions lingered, and times they grew. But here is what I'll say about questions brewing as you're working toward an innovative project. Let the questions brew. Wrestle with them. Tussle with them. Put them down on your walls, in your notebooks, wherever, but face the big question marks. What we want to work away from is allowing those questions to turn on themselves and become pure doubt. Doubt is a question imploded. If questions can lead the way, then doubt can wash out that very path that you're trying to forge. Gratefully, we honored the questions and did nurture the doubt.
So one of the scariest moments for a designer like myself is when an idea in my imagination seeks visual expression. Like, doubt often for me sets in when I ask, how do I get what I'm envisioning in my head out onto paper? And as you know, design often begins with a sketch. So the sketches that you're seeing here are the first collage sketches for the Lit Room, and they have in them embedded assumptions and more questions. You can see some of our initial assumptions. So there was some kind of superstructural frame, there was a wall-mounted screen, and continuum surface robots. So imagine soft, undulating robotic surfaces on the walls and hanging from the ceiling. This type of soft robot was something that was already being developed in our lab, so it was a natural assumption that it would have application here as well. And you can also see how the sketches question how the space could transform to turn words into worlds. So on the left is the sketch in the moment of where the wild things are, where the soft robotic continuum surfaces are striated into the space, representing the vines and the forests of Max's imagination. They're glowing green, and we were imagining forest sounds. And then on the right, you can see it's that moment in where the wild things are, where Max is on the boat and transporting himself from his room to the island where the wild things are, and instead the continuum surfaces are undulating in unison, and they're blue, and we were imagining ocean sounds.
Now, we know that Where the Wild Things Are was one book that really inspired this whole project, but this is a little fun fact. There was another type of book that was also the initial inspiration. Can you look really closely at this and tell me what book that was? Notice the soft sculptural elements at the top. Anybody? It's a Matchbook. Truthfully, I remember distinctly George coming home and taping a matchbook to our wall in the dining room and taking many, many photographs of it. So, and this kind of inspired the play on the word lit as well. Lots of fun little takes along the way.
So soon after those sketches were created, we worked on a low-fidelity prototype in our laboratory. It's a three-dimensional sketch, if you will, and perhaps you can see how our assumptions began to take shape.
So he was sent to bed without eating anything. That very night, in Max's room, a forest grew and grew and grew until his ceiling hung with vines, and the walls became the world all around. And an ocean tumbled by with a private boat for Max, and he sailed off through night and day, and in and out of weeks, and almost over a year to where the wild things are.
So you can see the soft robotic surfaces. We were assuming a wall-mounted touchscreen that actually housed the book in this, projected lighting and sound. But all these were assumptions, and assumptions that needed testing through interaction with children and librarians.
Now, for many years, public libraries have worked with this phrase, with and not for. And I bet that most everyone in this room has heard this phrase many times over the year. I hope you have. It's a really important phrase that has driven programming for many years, and it kind of changes the way we think about what we do as far as programmatic efforts with our public or stakeholders. Whether they are teens working on a cosplay event or senior adults trying to dive deeper into the digital world. Now, this is something that we at Richland Library, as well as many public libraries, I'm sure libraries of all types, are trying to get at. Truly community-driven programs where you're working shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm with your community to give programs, events, trainings, learning opportunities that they desire, that they want in their lives, not necessarily what we think they want or we think that they like. So with and not for is actually participatory design, acts of creation, sharing expertise, and learning from one another as a process unfolds, letting go of assumptions. Not so easy sometimes. Now, from the onset, we were excited to enter this partnership with the Clemson team because we agreed upon one thing. We were going to work closely with library staff and youth as integral partners in this project. We set the library up to be more than simply a showcase room for an incredible, beautiful robotics thing. And we welcome staff not as passive onlookers as robots entered their world. Now, we weren't clear all the time how this was going to unfold, but we were committed.
So participatory design is very challenging for a designer, as you can imagine. I think most designers tend to get very attached to our assumptions, our visions, our ideas. But in our laboratory, we believe that users are actually the experts that reveal the opportunities. And if we provide the opportunities to ask the questions and ask them in the right way with these users, unexpected things will be revealed, just like in any good story. So as Tony mentioned, we set out to engage children and librarians as design partners throughout this project. And sure enough, these experts busted nearly every assumption that we originally made about the lit room. So one of the challenges of designing interactive technologies at a large scale is how do you get useful feedback on a physical space before it's actually a space? So we devised methods of being able to talk about future space, such as this whiteboard activity with second graders, where they actually populated a sketch of the lit room on a magnetic whiteboard as if it were a dress-up doll. But instead, the children used color film to represent lighting, wrote the words for sounds, and placed magnetic robotic figures on the walls and ceilings to represent the moving elements, all in tandem with trying to bring a picture book that they had just read to life. So, assumption buster alert. What we learned from this early participatory design activity was that the soft, undulating robotic surfaces that had been developed in our laboratory weren't specific enough for these children to adapt to settings and characters and actions in the picture books they were reading. They specifically asked for a varied palette of shapes that were more representational. So we knew we'd have to go back to the drawing board and innovate. We also engaged with librarians in Richland Library in a paper prototyping activity where we tested the interface technology for the lit room. Here you can see the librarians conducting a read aloud or pretending to, adjacent to a paper version of a wall-mounted touchscreen interface that also displayed a version of the picture book, which was one of our initial assumptions. But another assumption buster alert. So I always felt, as the designer of the space, that in order to really innovate a new reading space, that the book should be a part of the space, literally in the wall. But after testing out a mobile tablet interface paired with a physical picture book, it was evident that the librarians were excited about the flexibility inherent in the mobile tablet. For example, because it wasn't attached to the frame itself, it could be programmed remotely, either at their homes or at their desks, and it could also be used anywhere in the space. And because it didn't actually house the picture book being read, the system also allowed for other types of children activities in the space. One librarian actually imagined the lit room being programmed for a dramatic play activity where children created their own story, programmed the environment, and then acted it out in a presentation.
So it was at this point in the tale of our project unfolding that we really realized it was not going to be just tech, new tech, new tech, new tech, robotics, robotics, robotics. It was really going to be a mixing and a matching of new and emerging technologies that we understood to a degree and the very traditional book that we know and love for ages.
And so through a process of participation and iteration, our initial assumptions revealed the true innovations in the project and help us to reinvent reading in the lit room. So at the top of this slide, you can see how the robotic technology transformed from the soft, undulating continuum surfaces to more modular elements that could be scored and perforated to create shapes and textures with a greater level of visual specificity. And because safety was a real priority for the librarians, all of the technology such as the lighting and sound became integrated into the robots instead of being projected onto them. And at the lower part of the slide, you can see how the aesthetic design of the space also emerged through interaction with the librarians. So one librarian in particular suggested that the aesthetic structure itself could provide an opportunity for learning engagement with children. She asked, what if we had a book in our collection that could serve as inspiration for how the lit room looks, its proportion, its color, its scale? And so as the robots became more modular, we researched artists and designers whose work was a reverberation of the machine age, such as Mondrian, whose painting you can see in the bottom of the slide ultimately became the inspiration for the final prototype of the lit room itself. So after over a year of interacting with children and librarians, we developed a fully functioning prototype, assembled and tested first in our laboratory, and then, over a couple months' time, in Richland Library's children's room.
There is really an effervescent quality to being in a space where innovation is happening, where something is being created, even if you don't know exactly what it's going to be. It's like that rush of peeking into a construction zone or thinking about the bubble and hiss of a laboratory, not knowing just what's happening behind the veil. The excitement that was built during that 4 months between the installation period that you just saw and the actual mounting of programs and the research components of the lit room was a priceless time. I compare to nothing. It's a component of innovation that is a category unto itself. So here's what I say. You must celebrate your construction zone time. Encourage people to wonder, to scratch their heads and ask, what exactly are you talking about? Don't just ask them to pardon your dust. Encourage them to ask questions about it.
So now that we've given you a peek into sort of the design and construction zone of the lit room itself, at this point you're probably asking questions like, how did the story turn out? And how did the lit room actually work? So suspense is a part of any good story, but at long last, here are the details. So the final prototype was approximately, just to give you a sense of scale, 12 feet square by about 9 feet high. You can see it did have an extruded metal superstructure, which is sort of silver in this photo, and 2 solid elements. There was a white tower in the front that housed the computer processor and the main power source, and then there was this red element that sort of created and defined a threshold into the space and also housed shelves for picture books. The prototype held 4 multimedia robots, 1 in each wall and 1 in the ceiling, seen here in white and here in vivid color. And each of those robots contain integral audio, lighting, motors for actuating the walls and ceilings. And it also contained, as I said, a collection of scored and perforated panels, as you can see on the bottom of the slide, that created different shapes and effects in the space when they were actuated. These could be changed out easily and attached to the robots with Velcro.
Now, I got to insert a real quick note for all the practical and budget-minded people in this room. I know there's at least one of you. I met you last night. 90% of the materials that were used to fabricate the lit room were actually purchased off of Amazon.com or at hardware stores around Columbia and Clemson. So another way to put your Prime account to good use.
Yeah, innovation doesn't have to come with a hefty price tag. So the mobile tablet interface that I talked about earlier, the prototype, in this case, it had 2 functions. So first, it's a tool for programming the space. So librarians and children could select the lighting, the sound, and the actuation settings for some or all of the robots in the space, and save these settings as scenes into the interface. And then after programming all of the scenes for a picture book, the tablet also functioned as the interface for activating the scenes during a read aloud with children. So here's a short video showing the lit room in action. So one day a librarian, played by yours truly, enters the lit room to program a multimedia read aloud for Peter Brown's Mr. Tiger Goes Wild. And so the librarian wants to create a scene that's evocative of the city where Mr. Tiger lives in the beginning of the story. And he looks through the collection of panels and selects one that represents, I guess, or resembles sort of a building or a structure when it's actuated. He attaches the panels to the system with Velcro and then begins to use the mobile tablet interface to explore lighting, sound, and actuation settings for this particular scene. So in this case, the illustration's white, and I'm probably thinking I'm going to select some from the library sounds, to select something that sounds like a city environment. Taking a look at it through the feedback mechanism, and then I save it into the system for a read aloud later.
Let's share the story together. Here we go. Mr. Tire Goes Wild by Peter.
They be running real fast. When you run real fast, you get tired.
Into the wilderness.
Wilderness in these days was
What you guys notice? The panels over here remind you of the story. He missed the city. He missed his home. What do you guys think Mr. Tire's going to do now? Michaela, what do you think he's going to do?
go back home.
You think he's going to go back home?
I think he's going to start acting like a person again.
You do? Do you think he's going to go back to being proper?
Yeah.
Don't you think he's still going to be wild?
Yeah.
Samuel, you think he's gonna be wild?
Because Tiger's supposed to be wild. Normal. Act like that, but go back to town.
So in this case, you can see how the effects are providing opportunities for the children to make predictions about the text and also to make connections to the picture book.
Now, the programmer and the producer in me just want to say, hey, just turn on the lights, turn on the sound, let's get the show on the road. But in truth, this was a research program. So I was reminded often that the importance of evaluation was ultimate. Even with a fully functioning prototype going up and running, there were still these questions that we needed to answer. Going back to how would the children respond? Would our librarians find it to be a useful tool in reading aloud with the children, or just another distraction, as we've said? Would it be such a distraction that it would actually help or hinder kids in comprehending the texts? These were the questions that we went after with the Clemson team.
So with Richland Library's help, we enlisted 2 classrooms of second grade kids to spend a day at the library. And along with the librarians, they helped us to collect the data on how effective and useful the system was for picture book read-alouds. And so we could better understand the efficacy of the prototype itself. Small groups of children seen here experienced the multi-sensory picture book read-aloud in the lit room, and for comparison, in a traditional storytime space. And after each read-aloud, children were asked to retell the story to a literacy expert and answer questions about the book. And they were also interviewed to gain information on their experience in the space, as well as its design features and what they would like to change. And we talked a little earlier about not knowing how our story would end, and sure enough, we were truly surprised by some of the findings. First, the data showed that reading in the lit room, where the multi-sensory effects provided opportunities for meaningful discourse with the children about the text, made the librarians more likely to scaffold their understandings through interaction, even in the traditional storytime space. So it actually made them better readers. Second, and most surprising, is that children actually attended to the picture book more in the lit room than in the traditional storytime space. So imagine, in a room where lighting and sound and moving surfaces augmented the storytime experience, children were more likely to actually engage with the physical book. And finally, we found that children's comprehension and their recall of the text actually increased in the lit room, especially, and this is important, for struggling readers. When immersed in a space that was evocative of the picture book being read, these young readers exhibited deeper understandings when compared to the traditional storytime space. So score 1 for interactive technologies. And now for the story after the story. So the lit room was only designed to survive the study. And one of the most surprising outcomes was that it was way more durable than we imagined, which meant more questions like, what would Richland Library want to do with it now that the research was finished? Would they take ownership of the space? And what was still left to learn from a practitioner's standpoint?
Now, just like any good story, there are turns and twists along the way. And as far as from a programming and service delivery standpoint, we think that these turns and twists are kind of like positive byproducts of innovation. Now, these byproducts can show up as the very answers to some of those looming questions you had before. So, for instance, remember that question we had in regard to library staff not being really sure if they could play a viable role in such a multi-layered project. Here's what we found out. Library staff grew their bank of skills and talents by the very mechanics of just going through the design process. Supported by university staff, they explored a deeper level of interactive book sharing that encouraged dialogue and interaction with children that was not just about sharing the book, not just about sharing the text, but creating the thing that we hear so much about these days, true conversation and learning from one another. It's nothing short of remarkable to see that play out. Our librarians took a lead in making decisions on the programming for the Lit Room after, like George said, after the research component was done. One librarian said, "This whole experience has really made me excited about the technology piece of story time." Now, this may not sound like a great declaration, but this was not what we heard going into this. There was a lot of apprehension, so it just turned on itself. So we had great stars in our eyes when that was said. Ultimately, our librarians became that integral part of a true research project that we never had the opportunity to otherwise. Now, having a sculptural like robotics room in your library can conjure up imaginations, and these imaginative conjurings helped our library staff see other opportunities to create programs for different types of educational contexts and users of different ages. For instance, our tween group learned how to program the Lit Room themselves completely from beginning to end. And they made decisions particularly on the design and the read-aloud experience for a book called Bringing in the New Year by author and illustrator Grace Lynn, who you may know. Now, this is Micah on the screen. She was one of our tweens who worked for 3 months to design the robotic screens, the panels, the sound effects, all for this particular book. And there was a great payoff. There I am. Why was I wearing that outfit? I told you not to put that in there. And there was a huge payoff for these particular kids because they were able to bring this picture book to life in the Lit Room for the very author, Grace Lynn, who happened to be in town for a storytelling festival. Big payoff. Do I have one more?
It's you. Keep going.
It's me. Oh, yes. Thank you. We learned a lot through this. Remember how our librarians, here we go. Yes, remember how our librarians wanted the Lit Room to inspire programs about modern art and architecture. Well, these kids spent an afternoon in the Lit Room learning about Mondrian and Frank Lloyd Wright. And then they took the experiences that they learned in the Lit Room and made their own masterpieces out of what kids do with Legos. And finally, there is that looming question, that big looming question, how will the children respond? Answers to this question emerged rather quickly. I recall that very first day we introduced first and second graders to the Lit Room. It was a big moment. If you could have seen the thought clouds over our heads that day, they would have likely read something like, "This is getting very real. This could be chaos." Now, our groups moved between the traditional story time, as George described, and then a story experience in the Lit Room. When the kids sat down in that Lit Room, they were amazingly calm. They were focused and fascinated. They weren't distracted by the moving parts. Later, they had a chance to investigate the program after their story time, to play around with it a little bit themselves, with the interface of the tablet. And they quickly made the connection between the tablet they were holding in their hands with the actual environment that they could control around them. We have talked much about the born digital, the digital native throughout the process of this project, and we thought we had a grasp on it. That morning, we saw it in action. Remember these essential tales we were talking about in the very beginning? We realized that morning we were telling an essential story using a new vernacular. It made all the difference. The children that we worked with during this project really, truthfully, easily took to the lit room. This is an assumption that we didn't really grasp in the beginning. Here you'll see one of our second grade students from Logan Elementary School who approached one of the activated panels with awe in his face, as if he were asking it to dance, and then truly gave it an embrace. Hugging a robot was an awesome experience.
So research is never an end in itself. It always leads to the next chapter. And much like fan fiction, we as researchers hope our work inspires others to test our theories and to advance the knowledge to write the next chapter. And so for us, one question arose was, how can we export the lit room experience into other contexts, because it's a large space? Could we explore the same technologies and package it into a smaller robotic device that could be checked out of the library, for example, and used in classrooms and homes? And we are currently working on writing our next chapter through what we call the Lit Kit, pictured here, a system that uses the similar technology to transform ordinary spaces like this classroom into multi-sensory story worlds. We're excited to explore this new tool for reinventing reading and its real-world impact, so stay tuned.
So we had an incredible wild ride figuring out this story, and the story still has an ellipsis on it, and we hope that you will stay tuned. But I wanted, like any great storyteller, they're going to summarize. So I'd like to give you something to put into your reinvention toolkit, things that you might have heard as refrains in this little tale of ours. Mix and match. We thought this project was going to be about tech, but there are many ingredients that we have in our essential stories. Mix them. Analog, staff, new emerging trends. Mix and match. Involve. Call on those who may not be called on that often to work on projects, especially your frontline staff members, if at all possible. These will help deepen deepen the roots of your program in pragmatic ways that you would never do otherwise. Finally, people are smarter, more intuitive, and more ready than you would ever guess, but they often need nudging. We did a lot of nudging in this project, and it worked for us. So please nudge forward into your innovative mind. Nudge forward, open that reinvention toolbox, and we thank you for listening to our tale of the lit room. Thank you for your attention. Thank you to the LCLC team. And if we have a moment, we can take a couple of questions.
I was wondering if the lit room incorporated smells.
It did not.
It's an awesome question.
It didn't. I think if we could have figured out a way to do it inexpensively, we probably would have. Any other questions? Yeah.
Where can we buy one?
Well, that's also a very good question. So for us, in a way, the next step is, what do we do with this now? We've tried to reach out to other libraries that may be interested in it. The reason it's still not in Richland Library, there's a couple reasons.
Good reasons.
Good ones. One is that Richland Library went under an entire renovation of their main library space, and so we had to take it out so that they could redesign the children's room. But another thing that we also learned is that because of other life things that happened with us, Tony and I were not able to sort of be in Columbia to be champions for the project. And one of the sort of the takeaways also here is that this type of thing needs consistent love and care and champions.
Yes, and the champion of innovation does not have to be the person that knows all the ones and zeros or the wiring of a unit. It has to be someone that's really cheering it on. You can find that engineer or that architect or that designer or that librarian that can do that inner work, but innovation does need a champion. We learned that especially toward the end of the project.
But it is currently back at Clemson University in pieces, since it was a modular system. So if anybody's interested in hosting this in their library, I would love to talk to you.
Thank you very
so
much.